Welcome. This is episode 11 of Traditional Right Live. I'm your host, Brent, and tonight I've got the regular cast with me. I've got Jeff Groom.
Good evening.
Sorry, let me just mute the video. And also, I have John and Bill.
What's up, guys?
Good evening from a snowy Cleveland.
You guys have snow up there?
Yes,
Yeah.
You got rain, we got snow.
Wow, that is a shame. You know, winter hasn't been terrible this year, but like now that it's later in the season and now it's deciding that it wants to start snowing, I just feel like it missed its chance. Normally I like winter, but you know, I don't want you anymore, winter. Go away.
Overstayed its welcome.
Yeah. I had a couple housekeeping things, but I cannot remember them off the top of my head at this point. So we're just going to dive right into it. The big news of the week really is that the government shutdown was averted, and Trump signed a bill that looked pretty rough to me. Bill, did you have an initial reaction to this?
I think that, as Bismarck said, politics is the art of the possible. I think President Trump got as much as he's ever going to get out of Congress with the existing bill. If he had opposed it, I don't think he would have gotten a better one, probably the opposite. As we all know, he has moved, having correctly assessed that Congress is never going to fund a border wall, he has moved to build one anyway by declaring a national emergency. As I said on previous shows, I think that is a mistake, and also I think it was unnecessary. I think in his position as commander-in-chief, he could have simply ordered the military to secure the border. But in any case, he has now declared a state of emergency. This isn't as unusual as people might think. It's been done since the 70s, I want to say 30-some times, but it does obviously set a precedent that if we get a Democratic president, they are likely to use to declare an emergency on climate change with enormous amounts of economic regulations coming out of that will do a real good job of sending the economy into a tailspin. But I do think that the president, if he wants the wall, he's going to have to go around Congress in order to get it. Congress is undoubtedly the House will pass a resolution disapproving the declaration of emergency. My guess is that will probably pass the Senate as well, but he can veto it, and then to override the veto, they need 2/3 in each House, and I don't think that's likely. So the probability is that the emergency declaration will stand. He can easily shift the money from the military construction budget. And so I think he is going to get his wall, is the bottom line.
So far, he's got $10 billion, I think, appropriated so far.
The military construction budget, as years ago, when I was on the Hill, the chairman on the House side of the House Armed Services Subcommittee for Military Construction said correctly, what would happen if one year we had no MILCON budget? Very little.
Right.
So if he takes the whole thing, it's not going to make any difference.
Right. And of course, he got 1.3 from the bill that he just signed, and there were all kinds of stipulations. He couldn't use the money for an actual wall. It just had to be fencing in areas where there already was fencing, and it can only be built in the Rio Grande Valley. It was bogus, but yeah,
What
again,
was the best he was going to get?
Right. What else was he going to get from that? Nothing.
And certainly people did not want to go into another shutdown. The first shutdown did not resonate well with the public, and I think he understood that. So I think he's made his move. I think it's going to stand. I think he's going to have the money to build the wall.
There are a lot of commentators saying that based on the language in the bill, he couldn't go ahead and use an emergency to build the wall because it was explicitly written out. He wasn't allowed to, and I don't actually think that that's true. Do you know anything about that?
I don't. I haven't seen the actual legislation, which I'm sure is voluminous, and I don't think it would stand up in court anyway.
Yeah, voluminous it is indeed. Included in the bill was it was 40 times that amount that's appropriated for the border security. 40 times that is going towards foreign aid. There's several $100 million set aside to study salmon. The entire federal budget is a joke.
Well, it's not just the federal budget, it's the whole legislative process. Most senators and congressmen have no idea what they're voting on. The bills are so complex, you get so little time to look them over. You're dependent on a staffer who's handling 6 different areas at once. And they really don't know what's in the legislation they're passing. I can remember saying both to Senators Taft and Senator Hart, when I was their staffer, that we ought to slip in quietly a declaration of war on, say, Andorra or Monaco, and it would undoubtedly go through. So I think that's a larger problem that needs to be addressed. The Congress needs to do a lot less legislating, but do it more carefully.
Yeah, agreed. At this point, Trump's presidential future and the wall itself, we just have to wait and see. The next big news is I'm seeing on Twitter, Trump is rattling his saber at Iran, and it seems like Israel was doing a little of the same.
This is the really big news of the week, frankly, in terms of our future, much more so than the president's declaration of an emergency. This is from the Thursday, February 14th New York Times. And it's from the conference in Poland it was supposed to be the Middle East. Generally, the US tried to focus it on Iran, much to the irritation of the Europeans. But it included Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel. And the Times reports, no sooner had he landed than the Prime Minister's Twitter account announced, quote, an open meeting with representatives of leading Arab countries that are sitting down together with Israel in order to advance the common interest of war with Iran, unquote. Now, they quickly realized, oops, somebody committed truth. So within an hour, that was changed to advance the common interest of combating Iran. But the truth, obviously, is the original statement. Israel and some of the Arab states that are indeed now allying with Israel quietly wants war with Iran. The problem with that is they will also want us to do the fighting. Here we have the Iraq scenario all over again with the same people, the neocons, particularly in the person of John Bolton, again trying to push a president into a war where our interests are not at stake. Iran is no threat to the United States. Saddam's Iraq was no threat to the United States. We were manipulated into the war with Iraq by neocons who are, in effect, undeclared foreign agents, undeclared foreign lobbyists. And they did so because they had participated, a number of them, in drafting a strategy for Israel's Likud party, which of course is Netanyahu, that called for the destruction of every Arab state that could be a threat to Israel. But of course, they didn't want Israel to do the fighting. So they pushed us and manipulated us into doing the fighting. The result is 5,000 Americans dead and a still unfolding catastrophe in the Middle East. By the way, the destruction of Saddam's Iraq eliminated the principal regional barrier to Iran's expansion. Israel has since figured out that was a dumb move. But they now want to make another dumb move. Netanyahu has been described in Israel as a tactical genius and a strategic idiot. And this is a good point. A war with Iran could easily result in the destruction of the Iranian state, as happened in Iraq, as has happened in Syria, as has happened with our help in Libya. And the organizations that will arise in a stateless Iran will be a far greater threat both to Iran's Arab neighbors and to Israel than will the state of Iran. Capital cities can't get it that we've moved beyond a world where the threat is coming from other nation states. And we need to understand that the far more dangerous threat is the kind of non-state entities that arise once a state collapses. In any case, just as with Iraq, what we're going to see here is the neocons trying to maneuver President Trump into a war with Iran. Because Israel wants the war, some of these Arab states do too, including Saudi Arabia, but they don't want to do the fighting. And how many guys are we going to lose? How many young Americans fighting Iran? We will think it'll just be a sea and air war that would be easy. But the Iranians aren't that stupid. They have got thousands of US hostages in the form of American troops in Iraq, who are surrounded by Iranian-controlled Shiite militias. Still, though President Trump has wisely been trying to pull them out, the Pentagon has blocked him. We have a couple thousand troops in Syria, again surrounded by Iranian-controlled militias. And we have still thousands of troops in Afghanistan. And the Iranians have been mending fences with the Taliban. So we could very easily see a situation where suddenly Iran counters a sea and air war on our part with a move on the ground that nets them thousands of American GIs as prisoners. What's our next move at that point? I guarantee you the neocons won't have the slightest idea.
So our greatest security threat is actually Israel?
I wouldn't put it quite that way. One of our larger national security threats is Israel's Likud party. Because, of course, not all Israelis support Likud. Most American Jews do not support Likud. It is Israel's Likud party, its expansionist aims, and its repeated attempts. Well, it's expansionist Zionism. It's Zionism from the river to the sea, as many of the Likudniks say. So at least from the Jordan all the way to the Mediterranean, and some interpret that statement as from the Euphrates all the way to the Mediterranean. And it is our willingness to be manipulated, again, largely by the neocons, into serving as Israel's unpaid Hessians, which is what we did in Iraq and what they're now going to want us to do in Iran.
No doubt.
Anyway, that's the real big news of the week. And it's very interesting that this bombshell has gotten almost no coverage. It's carefully being overlooked.
It's anti-Semitic. Could you say anything to the contrary?
If you criticize not just Israel, but even to criticize the Likud is considered anti-Semitic. People are so afraid of that that they say, well, we simply can't discuss these issues. But again, this has the potential for geostrategic disaster. Do you know what the price of gas is going to be in this country if there's a war in the Persian Gulf? Not to speak of whether we can get gas at all.
I think we go into
Well, that's why we have to take the oil from Venezuela, right?
Yes, that would be the next neo-concept. Would be to go in to bring democracy and human rights to Venezuela, which doesn't seem to want them particularly. All of these adventures end badly. We have a military that has shown repeatedly it does not know how to fight these kinds of wars. It can fight the tethered goat that is a third world country's formal military, like we did in Iraq, when it was just Saddam's army and air force and so forth. But as soon as it becomes an insurgency, as soon as we are facing non-state opponents, we lose. And that's inevitable if you're a second-generation military, which is what we have.
Yeah, war is theater at this point, basically.
Exactly, and the theater is simply designed to keep the money flowing.
Right.
This is all typical of a military in a state that's reached its final rococo state of complexity just before the whole thing collapses. This is Prussia marching off in 1806 all by itself to fight Napoleon. And it's not going to be pretty. So,
yeah, I think an Iran war would be the one that breaks our back.
I agree.
It very easily could be. And you don't know who else it's going to pull in. And it's the Chinese, of course, are delighted to see us make stupid moves like invading Afghanistan, invading Iraq, and so forth, because these things are just bleeding us dry. They don't have to do anything to us. They just sit back and watch us bleed ourselves to death in stupid, pointless wars we don't know how to win.
Yep.
So do you think that there's a real possibility something will kick off, or is this just more showboating?
I think there is a real possibility because the neocon influence in the White House is growing. And whereas President Trump, as he stated in his State of the Union message, understands he was elected as a peace president. He talked about a stupid war being one of the potential threats to our otherwise booming economy. He has a blind spot on Iran. He apparently has never asked himself the question, well, wait a minute, just how is Iran a threat to the United States? Which obviously it isn't. He has a blind spot here, and the neocons are exploiting this to the limit. We're getting more and more neocons moving into the administration. Again, John Bolton was the worst possible choice from the whole universe for the position of National Security Advisor. And I'm afraid that Trump could forget, again, why he was elected, which was to end stupid wars and start one of their own. And it would, of course, be the neocons doing everything in their power to manipulate him into it, because they are, some of them anyway, are part and parcel of the good.
Yeah, he may or may not have good instincts about foreign policy, but I think right now, especially where he's in so much political trouble, he's got people whispering in his ear that, you know, the base really loves when you do all the fighting for Israel unquestionably. And, you know, wartime presidents tend to get reelected. So you should really just think about invading Iran.
I'm sure they are using every argument under the sun to try to manipulate him into this war. And again, I'm afraid he may be vulnerable to this. In fact, the base is totally fed up with these wars.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, because it's their kids who get killed or come home permanently damaged. Their kids are the ones who enlist in the military. It's not the elite's kids on the coasts who do so. It's the Heartland's kids. That's Trump's base. And they're really tired of seeing their kids come home either crippled or in body bags. And for what? And no one has an answer to the question, for what? Well, there'll be no answer to the question of why are we at war with Iran?
Yeah.
So I'm very much afraid that the neocons have the same relationship to him that they did to George W. Bush. Trump, frankly, is a lot smarter than George W. Bush, who may have been the dumbest man ever to occupy the White House. But I think the process is very much the same, just constantly working on him, and using every argument they know, and all, frankly, in the interests of a foreign power.
Bill, what's your take on, we hear the rhetoric of, oh, we're going to go to war with Iran. My understanding from Iran is that they have a decent, Navy in terms of like their boats, and their Navy runs these drills about we're going to get swarmed by, Iranian swift boats. Would the invasion go through Iraq through a ground? So like, let's say just hypothetically we go to war with Iran. How do you think that looks in the first, month, the first 24 hours? Like, what would the USA do? How do we get to Iran physically to occupy them? It just sounds to me, the scale of this operation sounds just preposterous.
Well, again, there would be a fantasy, because this is the general fantasy in the Pentagon, that there wouldn't be a ground war, that we could do this all, quote, surgically, unquote, with airstrikes, missile strikes, drones, and yes, our Navy could easily beat the Iranians. The main Iranian naval threat is not to our warships, although we would probably lose a few. The main threat is to the tanker traffic in the Gulf. Their Navy is capable, the speedboats, all of that kind of thing, of stopping the tanker traffic, particularly with mines. We have very poor mine warfare capabilities in the U.S. Navy. And but the fantasy in Washington is always this techno war, where that can be waged by women sitting at computer consoles in Colorado, and the whole thing's kind of a video game. But I don't think that's the way the Iranians are going to fight.
All right. Yeah.
I, for one, would be excited to see some Tomcats flying again.
There would be some flying. How well they would fly is another question. Be old,
Right.
and it was a really crappy fighter to begin with. It was, I think, more the Garfield than the Tomcat.
Yeah.
I think Iran had some of those, didn't they? Did they buy some of those? They have Cobras too.
Yes.
They still fly.
The Iranians are still flying F-14s, and I think they're still flying Phantoms. So in terms of the video game aspect of the war, it might be kind of fun to watch. But the reality is that I don't think the Iranians are going to just fight the kind of war we want them to. I think they're smarter than that.
So, Bill, what was your next bit of news?
I have a good list of clippings. Today's New York Times, this is Sunday, actually gives the president a bouquet, and rightly so. It says, asylum policies wearing down many at border. We should, of course, be cheering for this. Pushed beyond their limits by prolonged waits in dangerous and squalid condition in parts of northern Mexico. Thousands of caravan members who had been waiting to seek asylum in the United States appear to have given up. Hurrah! Mexican officials said, dealing President Trump an apparent win after a humbling week for his immigration agenda. Well, it hasn't been a humbling week for his immigration agenda. And this is actually very important. These caravans were invasions. And the president has stopped them from coming in. And according to the Times, the people are giving up and either deciding to stay in Mexico or going home. That's a victory. That's a much more important victory than a legislative victory on the Hill. That has stopped an invasion.
That's awesome.
Yes. And for the Times to give credit, that's very, very rare. Of course, in fact, we're supposed to weep great crocodile tears for the poor refugees that, they have to go back to where they came from. Well, yeah, that's what they need to do, is go back where they came from and clean up the mess they made of their own countries rather than bringing that mess here. Simple as that. There was a very interesting piece in the New York Times Sunday magazine a week ago talking about a French intellectual and writer, Eric Zemmour. And the title is, The Rights of Man Are the Death of France. And of course, he's absolutely right. And this is important far beyond France. You have to understand that at least since the late 17th century, the Western world, Western culture have largely been dominated intellectually by the French. And that is still to a significant degree true today. So intellectual developments in France are actually very important for the West as a whole. And I'm not going to talk too much about the content of what is, as you would expect from a French intellectual, a complex piece. But I'm going to quote one paragraph here. And this is quoting Mr. Zemmour. I'm accustomed to saying that when you have the biggest population in Europe and the giant army of Napoleon, the rights of man are magnificent. You can impose it on everyone. Zemmour said that evening. This was in a speech in France. But when you're 1% of the world population, and when we have 1.5 billion Africans at our door who, in the name of the rights of man, want to come to France, I say the rights of man are the death of France. This is pretty strong stuff. And of course, he's absolutely right. There's an important distinction that has been lost in this country between English and French conceptions of rights. The English conception that drove our revolution is that rights are concrete and specific. For example, I have a right not to pay tax on my tea unless I'm represented in Parliament. Okay? These are rights that were established slowly, first in practice before they were recognized in law. It took a long time to establish, and were largely created by precedent, not by some grand legislative declaration. The French concept coming out of that civilizational disaster we know as the French Revolution is, again, this proclamation that if you can imagine a right, you just proclaim it and it exists. So now we have rights to anything and everything anyone can imagine. The problem with rights like that is, first of all, they're not workable, most of them. And second, they're not real. If it's based on nothing, it can easily be taken away. If it hasn't been established in practice and in precedent, there's no notion of is this functional or dysfunctional. So the French concept of rights, he's absolutely right. Under the French concept of the rights of man, not the rights of Frenchmen, not the rights of the citizens of Bordeaux, but specifically the rights of all of humanity. Yes, everybody in Africa has a right to move to France. This is the kind of poison that flowed out of the French Revolution. And it's very significant that, again, French intellectual, and an important one, is questioning something that is at the very heart of the mythology of the French Revolution. So keep an eye on intellectual developments in France. They are always important for the rest of the West. Meanwhile, from the Wall Street Journal, January 17th, a friend of mine sent me a clipping. It's good to know that new guidelines from the American Psychological Association define, quote, traditional masculinity, unquote, as a pathological state. If you're a traditional man behaving as men have behaved for many centuries, you have a mental illness. You're sick. You need to see a psychologist. Unless you're a weak, wimpy, feminized man,
Soy boy.
right, you're sick. And this is the official statement of the Professional Association of American Psychologists. The war on men is becoming both so obvious and so absurd that do these people think there isn't going to be a reaction to this? Do they think that real men are going to put up with this kind of nonsense? It shows how completely disconnected, again, from the reality of life in the heart of man the elites are. And of course, all members of the elite.
I wouldn't put too much stock into what psychologists say. We all know where that modern psychology comes from. But what's amazing is really how many people buy into this and other sorts of things like it. It's as if we're saying, everything that people did for the, 40,000 years of human history, that anybody has any evidence of existing, that's all wrong. We're supposed to give all that up, pretend it doesn't exist. Only these new rules apply. It's really amazing.
Kind of an extension of evolutionary theory where basically we make it up as we go along. There's nothing prior that exists before anything. We're all blank slate when we're born, and we make it up as we go along.
It's the tabula rasa concept of society, which comes again out of the misnamed Enlightenment, out of particularly French philosophy in the 18th century, and it couldn't be more false. When no one is born a blank slate.
Right.
So as a discipline, yes, psychology lies somewhere between phrenology and witchcraft. But what is important here is that it's a very open statement by the elite that they're at war on. They're in a war on men. It's as simple as that. And this comes back to the essence of cultural Marxism, the goal of which is to invert all traditional power relationships. So women are to be placed over men, blacks over whites, gays over straights, etc. everything that has, again, developed in 40,000 years or more of human evolution is suddenly to be thrown out the window, as if we could do that, which of course we cannot. And we are to create this new man, I'm tempted to say new Soviet man, yes, we've heard this before, who bears no relationship to anything that has ever occurred before.
Isn't comrade a gender neutral?
Yes. I guess in their view, in another couple decades, we'll all be is something.
Right.
Yes.
Yep.
Isn't that the words that Freud used? Like for, when you hear the word pathological, I just recently read Kevin McDonald's book, The Culture of Critique, and that's something that comes up a lot when he talks about Freud and how Freud's work says that men liking women and like the man being the head of the household is like a pathological condition. So it's interesting the word pathological is used, because I've heard that many times before reading about Freud, actually.
Well, it's a medical term, and what it's a fancy word for saying you're sick.
Right.
It was that.
Yeah.
Precisely. So if you're a traditional man, you're sick. You need a psychiatrist. This is, of course, exactly what Adorno's book, The Authoritarian Personality, says. If anyone, man or woman, who follows traditional ways of living and traditional morals is sick, they need a psychiatrist.
Mm-hmm.
And Freud, interestingly, though he was probing these depths of the unconscious, he is socially very conservative. His view of what all of these things he was talking about, these complexes, all the rest, is that they point to the need for an ordered society to contain a lot of these things.
Right.
But of course, the Frankfurt School, though it drew heavily from Freud, it read him backwards, if you will, and said, no, we can use a lot of these conditions that Freud identified to create this new society of all play and no work, of the Dionysian over the Apollonian, and so forth. It's Marcuse's book, Eros and Civilization, that by liberating non-procreative Eros, we can create this paradise where it's just, if it feels good, you do it, and there are no consequences. Right. Unfortunately, as we have found since the 60s, there are consequences, and they're not good ones. Mm-hmm. So, an interesting piece also from, I think this is the Wall Street Journal, about, the title is "A Chilling Letter Has Davos Chattering." Of course, this is the great meeting at Davos of all of the world's top money people in Switzerland. And a fellow who is noted for being a pretty sharp investor wrote a letter talking about the coming debt crisis. And this is something, of course, we've talked about here on our show more than once. He details the way virtually every developed country has taken on mounting debt since the financial crisis in 2008, a trend that he says could lead to a financial panic. He cites the increasing ratio of government debt to gross domestic product between 2008 and 2017 to a point exceeding 100% in the United States and nearing that figure in France, Canada, Britain, and Spain. Quote, "The seeds of the next major financial crisis, or the one after that, may well be found in today's sovereign debt levels." Of course, it's not just sovereign debt, it's private debt as well. And more of that is going bad. Auto loans, mortgages, etc. The school loans, a tremendous problem. We are seeing this accumulation of bad debt that is one of the things that normally does kick off a financial panic. And I think this guy may be onto something.
I would agree.
From New York Times again, of course, the farce in the state of Virginia continues as the Democrats at the head of the Virginia government find themselves hoisted on their own petard of political correctness. Couldn't happen to a more deserving bunch. And what really struck me is the first sentence in this article. Justin F. Fairfax's, this is the, I believe, Lieutenant Governor of Virginia, a Democrat who is black,
It's a black guy, yeah.
refusal to resign as lieutenant governor of Virginia in the face of 2 allegations of sexual assault has presented Democrats with an excruciating choice. Now, think about that for a minute. Have these allegations been proven? No. They're simply accusations. In the face of 2, overwhelming number, obviously, 2 allegations by women, who we all know never invent things, of sexual impropriety, are supposed to drive a lieutenant governor to resign his office.
Well, Bill, don't be a bigot. You have to believe these women.
Absolutely, yes. We all know throughout all of history, anything a woman has said has always proven true. Somehow Caesar didn't quite buy that from Cleopatra, I don't think. But this is starting to make the Salem witch trials look pretty rational. When someone is immediately to resign their position and terminate their career because a woman alleges something. No proof needed. She just says it happens. And we must immediately assume she's telling the truth, and he must resign. This makes the term witch hunt seem mild, if you will.
Absolutely.
This is a more than that. This is a heresy hunt. This is you're in front of the Inquisition because the chambermaid thought she overheard you whispering the word Protestant. It's funny to watch the Democrats get caught in this because they're the ones who promoted this nonsense. But at the same time, it shows just how far into total absurdity the left has gone. And it's going to be more and more fun to watch because anyone who crosses the left in any way is going to immediately have women claiming some kind of sexual impropriety. And yes, they'll be inventing it in many cases. Fortunately, most conservatives' answer to that is, yeah, where's your proof, Tootsie? Right? And since they don't have any, the answer is your problem.
Yeah, calling bullshit is kind of worse than actual doing it.
Exactly. So that is also interesting. There was an interesting column by Ross Dutat, the New York Times conservative columnist, one cheer for the Green New Deal. And it does, however, point out that the first major policy intervention from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, one really wonders why someone with a name like that is in the U.S. Congress, the noted social media personality and future dictator for life of the Americas, I believe she's also a congresswoman of some sort, is a quite extraordinary document, a blueprint for fighting climate change that manages to confirm every conservative critique of liberal environmental activism, every Republican suspicion of what global warming alarm is really about. The core conservative suspicion is that when liberals talk about the dire threat of global warming, they're actually seizing opportunity on the issue to justify, well, full socialism. The seizure of the economy's commanding heights in order to implement the most left-wing possible agenda. Well, yes. The good news is it isn't only conservatives, and again, that was from the New York Times, who are seeing this. If you want to shut down the U.S. economy overnight and throw us into a full-scale depression, which we may be heading for anyway,
right, there's
no better way to do it than to try to end the use of all fossil fuels in 10 years. That's what the plan calls for. And yet, most Democratic presidential aspirants have signed on to it. Of course. And it's going to be kind of funny watching them try to wriggle out from under what they've signed on to once the implications are recognized, that all those Democratic voters who actually work for a living, there still are some, they're not all on welfare, are going to be thrown out of work. Right. Because the whole economy is...
Look at California.
Yes, the whole economy is going to shut down if you suddenly stop the use of all fossil fuels. It is simply a power grab. Now, I do think climate is changing. Which direction it's changing, I don't know. Whether it's man-made or whether it's natural forces, or most likely both, and what the balance is, I have no idea. And we are going to get, at some point, climate panic. And the warning here is this is what the left is going to try to do. It's going to try to use panic over climate change to put through full socialism, to take total control of the economy and turn it into, hey, guess what? A planned economy. And guess how well that worked in this case of the old Soviet Union.
Right.
We will have the Soviet standard of living, is what it comes down to.
And 100 million bodies to go with it.
Yes, exactly, because we want to be food.
Right.
It's interesting that, you know, she talks about we got to clean up the climate, but if you look at any chart of who's the top 10 polluters of the ocean, USA isn't even in the top 30. It's China and third world countries in Africa. You look at the top 10 polluters of rivers, top 10 polluters of the air, the dirtiest cities in the world. None of them are Western, European, American. None of them fit that bill. So all the countries that actually are good stewards of the economy, that practice conservation as it was meant to be practiced, are rich countries that went through the Industrial Revolution. And she's of the opinion that you can just reverse all that and then still work. Like, the rest of the world's not going to play ball, so why should we? So.
Well, that's the point. If we were to do everything the Green New Deal calls for, the carbon levels would continue to rise because the Chinese, the Indians, they're building coal-fired power plants hand over fist. The Chinese are finally beginning to rethink that, but the Indians are not. All of these developing countries are saying, we're going to follow the same path you did in the Industrial Revolution. If you had a right to do it, so do we. And this is actually pretty stupid on their part. They would benefit if they bypassed some of the steps of the Industrial Revolution. Learn from our mistakes. But they're not going to do that. What they're going to do is they're going to copy all of our mistakes. They're going to follow the pattern that had started emerging in England in the late 18th century, and pour all of this stuff into the air and in the waters. And Jeff, you're exactly right. They're the big polluters, not the US. We could go to carbon zero and it wouldn't help the climate change problem because other countries aren't going to do that.
Right.
The Fukushima plant that had that meltdown years ago is still emitting toxic radioactivity into the ocean, polluting all the food and the fish that they get off the Japanese coast. So
yes.
Yep. No big deal.
I actually generally favor nuclear power. It is the one variety of power that has the least environmental impact. And unlike the Fukushima plant, the kinds of plants we have here, there are new designs for nuclear power plants where if something goes wrong, it is built in that it shuts down. In other words, it's not machinery that has to shut down the reaction. If you don't do things that keep the reaction going, if in effect you lose power, think of it that way, it automatically shuts down. Yeah. Right. And that makes the whole thing a great deal safer. We could be going in this direction. We should be going in this direction. But the same environmentalists who howl about coal-fired power plants and natural gas-fired power plants, they hate every form of power generation. If it's hydroelectric, it's bad for the fish. If it's windmills, it's bad for the birds. If it's tidal, that's bad for the coastline. Every form of power generation they scream about, and yet you go into their houses, because these are almost all elite upper middle class people. They have every electronic device in creation all plugged in and all drawing power all the time. But there is not a single source of power generation they'll approve. And then finally, from, again, the New York Times, Sunday, this is the 16th of February, the business section. Democrats are pushing aggressive new taxes and questioning the bedrock assumptions of their party. The only thing more startling than the flurry of tax proposals Democrats have unveiled in recent weeks is the full throttle response they've gotten from the public. And then it goes on to talk about all of these different soak the rich plans. There's the soak the rich plans, Ones that were only recently considered ridiculously far-fetched or political poison have received serious and sober treatment, even by critics, and remarkably broad encouragement from the electorate. Roughly 3 out of 4 registered voters surveyed in recent polls supported higher taxes on the wealthy. This is something conservatives have to take into account, and it really divides the conservatives from the libertarians. On economic issues, conservatism in this country has been more and more strongly influenced by libertarianism, which of course says all government is bad, there shouldn't really be any taxes, and so forth. Conservatives are not libertarians. Libertarians, among other things, are ideologues, and conservatives are not. But conservatives are now going to have to take into account politically that there is, very understandably, growing resentment among the middle class, the Republican constituency, as they see their economic situation steadily deteriorating. There's resentment directed against the super rich and their affluent lifestyle. This is a political reality. And if the Republicans do what they tend to do and simply see themselves as servants of Wall Street, and won't take this growing resentment into account, then these democratic voices are going to get a lot of support. There is an interesting way to do this, and that is to support a high rate of taxation, I would say 70%, on all earned income over $1 million a year. Now, why do I say earned income? Because if you apply it to investment income, to dividends, savings, and so forth, you're going to tremendously discourage investment. And you're going to undermine the basics of the economy. If there isn't more investment, then there isn't more jobs. So you don't want to disincentivize investment. But if you put the tax on earned income, who does it hit? Yeah, it hits Wall Street. But it also hits a lot of Democratic constituencies. It hits the entertainment world, which is heavily Democratic. It hits the sports world. We've got baseball players making $1 million a month. Yeah, I can see how
$1 million contract.
I can see a 70% tax rate on that making a great deal of sense. And somehow I don't think they'll starve despite that.
Yeah, it'll be okay.
And the searching for an economic term I can't think of now. The degree to which people respond to changes in tax rates differs between what they get for labor and what they get for investment. So that you can actually tax labor at a higher rate without disincentivizing the labor nearly as much as you would disincentivize the investment. It's the kind of idea conservatives need to be thinking about. The libertarians will scream bloody murder because, again, they're against all taxes. But if conservatives present themselves to the broad American public as simply defenders of Wall Street, it's not going to go over politically.
I guess if we didn't spend as much money on dumb projects like researching salmon, for instance, we wouldn't need taxes. We wouldn't need taxes to be that high to begin with.
Well, we certainly don't need taxes to be as high as they are. We all know that government is monumentally inefficient, and that includes the Pentagon. The problem is the Republicans usually want to cut everything except the Pentagon, even though the Pentagon is now the world's largest planned economy.
Right. Oh, absolutely. I just feel like we're trying to treat symptoms as opposed to causes in most cases.
We are in most cases. And of course, if you form a government bureau to solve a problem, what happens if it solves the problem?
Kind of money stops.
It puts itself out of business.
Yep.
So it immediately becomes a bureau for perpetuating the problem, not for solving it.
Right, right.
If we want to solve problems, we need to remember a very basic rule of taxation. If you want more of something, subsidize it. If you want less of something, tax it. On that basis, for example, the government would subsidize work and tax welfare. Because if you tax it, you're going to get less of it. If a woman got less welfare for each new kid she had instead of more, do you think that isn't going to affect behavior? Of course it is. We've been, since the 60s, we've been paying women to have illegitimate kids. If it's within a marriage, there's no payment. It has to be illegitimate.
Right.
So we've not surprisingly had an explosion in illegitimacy. If we instead taxed illegitimacy, we would get less of it.
That's just part of the male patriarchy.
Oh yeah, absolutely, yes.
I think in America, taxation has two purposes. One is social engineering, like you're describing, taxing and subsidizing certain behaviors. And then two, to keep the inflation from spiraling out of control, because ultimately the taxes don't really play a role in what the federal budget ends up being. We spend as much money as we feel like spending, and then we borrow the rest from the future or print more money.
Right. I think that that's basically correct. And we're going to find out that that is not, as the left likes to say, sustainable. And that's why there is a debt crisis coming. So all of these things, the big question, really big question, politically, that nobody's talking about, is what happens when you take a society with all of these tensions, political tensions, cultural tensions, religious tensions, ethnic tensions, and so on, a society that is being held together by prosperity, and you take away the prosperity, which is exactly what a debt crisis is going to do. Mm-hmm. And I think at that point, things are going to get all too interesting. And that's where the Victoria scenario comes in, the scenario in the novel Victoria, of the country breaking up. We live in an era around the world, we can see it very plainly elsewhere, where the state is in decline. And I would argue the state is in decline here as well, particularly in terms of its legitimacy with the heartland, because too often the state has been used as a weapon to try to force cultural Marxism down everybody's throat. And if you take a state that already has increasingly questionable legitimacy, and you now collapse the economy, what does that state have left to offer? What does it mean to people at that point?
It can't fulfill its basic functions anymore.
Exactly. And we already see it not doing a very good job fulfilling its most basic function, which is providing order, safety of persons and property. In most of our big cities, in at least the inner core of the city, it doesn't do that anymore. And those people are left largely to be victims of anybody who's got a gun. So the state is fading, as Martin van Crefeld pointed out years ago. In Britain, and this was decades ago, and I'm sure it's even more true now, there are far more people in private security than in all of the state armed forces. What does this tell you?
You're on the edge.
Exactly. So, Jeff?
You made me really think about how, like, you take away the prosperity, and if that's gone and there's nothing else left that binds people together and gives them a cause to get along, then we are going to be in trouble. And it reminded me of what I saw and read about in Korea. Is they have a vibrant economy, but they also have an incredible sense of unity in that country. And they actually don't even practice true capitalism. They have a system that the Korean word's called chaebol, where meaning like their corporations look after each other even when the other one fails. Like, so for instance, Hyundai, I think it was Kia, went out of business in the early 2000s or something like that when the 99 debt crisis hit Korea. And Hyundai was so considerate of their other, Korean brothers that they brought that country back from bankruptcy. That would be the equivalent of Ford watching GM fail, and then Ford going, you know what, you're Americans too. We're going to get you back on your feet. That's so cutthroat in America. They would have been laughing all the way to the bank. But Korea, they don't see themselves that way. We're all one people. We're all in this together. And even if they lost their economic prosperity for a short period of time, they would be able to get themselves back on their feet. That we don't have that in America. All we have, like you said, is this idea that we're a country with an economy, not the other way around, which is complete total bullshit.
Yeah, well, we're an economy with a country, in other words. Yes.
Yeah.
It used to be said that Prussia was an army with a country instead of a country.
Right.
But it's especially because we are less and less one people.
Right.
This multiculturalism means Korea is not multicultural, as you know very well. Quite the contrary. It's essentially impossible to become Korean or Japanese or Chinese or these other cultures. Someone cannot become American without speaking a word of English. And when you take a multicultural country, and one again where the state already is not doing a very good job of maintaining order, and the deal with the citizenry will pretend that the state is legitimate so long as the economy booms. You take away that boom, and it gets very interesting.
Right. Well, Yugoslavia is doing pretty well right now, so I wouldn't really count that out too soon. But Yugoslavia is. Oh, never mind. Sorry.
I remember when I was on Capitol Hill having dinner with a Yugoslav general, and I asked him, "What's going to happen when Tito goes?" And I said, "Is it all going to break up?" He said, "No, absolutely not." He was Croat. I think, no, that never happened. We've passed all of those. That's just history now. And, as the old saying goes about the Balkans, the problem is they produce more history than they can consume locally.
Nice.
That's my list of issues for actually the last couple of weeks. But again, to circle back to the beginning, the really big one here that we should be up in arms about is Netanyahu's announcement that Israel and its de facto Arab allies, including Saudi Arabia and Egypt, want war with Iran. And again, don't think that they're planning on doing the fighting. We're supposed to do that.
We've got a few questions from the live chat. Just a reminder, if you have questions or comments, you can put them in the live chat while we are live, or you can send an email to traditionalright@gmail.com, and we can read things on the live on the stream live if they're relevant or they add to the conversation or whatnot. We're just happy to hear from people if you have something to say. So drop us a line. The first question we have is from Puppet Perception. He says, "Hail Victoria. Does Mr. Lind have any thoughts on the significance of religion and its relationship to power, order, the use of language, and the legitimacy of the state?"
Well, if you read Hobbes, of course, it's overwhelming. The state's legitimacy was traditionally bound up intimately with religion. Hobbes, of course, was writing in 17th century England, and about a third of Leviathan is devoted to a defense of Anglican theology and its relationship to the state, because the king was head of the church after 1530. So when you completely secularize a state, to the degree we see in, say, France today, where laïcité is one of the most fundamental principles of the state, then you've already taken away one of the major props to the state's legitimacy. And here, there is still the outward form, at least, of a civic religion that is sort of vaguely, broadly Christian. Obviously, the Constitution does not speak about a wall between church and state. That was in a private letter by Thomas Jefferson. And religion played a major role. If you look at George Washington, who remains our greatest president, and many of his public statements, he is constantly invoking the divinity. And not only proclaiming days of thanksgiving, but days of fasting. The president has the right to proclaim both, by the way. Given the obesity issue, we should perhaps be proclaiming more fasting days. But there's no question that, as Russell Kirk wrote, culture comes from the cult. And when a society loses its religious faith and its religious unity, its culture is going to follow, and the legitimacy of the state is intimately bound up with that culture. So yes, there's no question, the loss of the broad Christian consensus that was true of this society certainly up to the 1950s is a major factor in the growing crisis of legitimacy of the state.
Very good. The next one is from Chapman. He asks, Mr. Lind has proposed the U.S. build alliances with China and Russia to sustain the state system. How does he believe we do so without opening ourselves to further subversion by them as they seek to claim a superior global position by pulling us down?
The answer is that with China particularly, Russia's economy is in such a condition that it is not a threat at all in terms of the kind of threat we face from China economically. What we need to do, and this is doable, is we need to confront China, as the president has been doing, on trade issues, intellectual property issues, balance of trade, all of those kinds of things, while working cooperatively with them on the grand strategic requirement we all face, Russia, China, the US, and every other state, which is maintaining the state system in the face of the challenge of fourth generation war and of spreading state failure and state collapse. The two can be separated. The Chinese have talked about this as well. And it's unfortunate, in my view, that the Trump administration has not attempted to do that. I'd note also that because China's not a free market economy. China's essentially, the state sector of the economy is still a very important part of it. The potential is there for managed trade. And the Chinese, again, have been doing some of this. They've just said, we're going to buy so many million tons of soybeans from you. Where we sit down actually and come up with a list. You're going to buy X, Y, and Z from us, and we're going to buy A, B, and C from you, and we get a rough balance of trade. The Chinese are open to that. It's the free market fanatics in the Republican Party who are not. So I think these are separable issues. But if we continue with the three major states, the three great powers today, which of course are the United States, Russia, and China, continue to be at odds with one another, it's very similar to what we saw in Europe in 1914, where the three great monarchies of Russia, Austria, and Germany were at odds with one another. And the result was the destruction of all of them and a whole new state paradigm. The new paradigm that will come out of the US, Russia, and China essentially destroying each other will be a stateless world. And to come back to Hobbes once again, in a stateless world, life is nasty, brutish, and short. So I think there's a way to do this, but unfortunately, we're not doing it.
We've got one last question from Perry Marcin. He says, is JSOC the Pentagon's half-assed attempt to do 4GW?
Yes. And it is a very half-assed attempt. You're absolutely right, or maybe quarter-assed. There are a few elements in JSOC that have got a clue about 4GW, but most of them are simply better resourced, technically better trained, second-generation outfits. They still wage war of attrition by putting firepower on targets. So the reality is that the Pentagon has not been attempted to come to grips with 4GW. It did attempt it in the early days of the Iraq conflict. You had the manual that Petraeus put out. It was essentially a rehash of a lot of stuff coming out of Vietnam. But fourth generation war isn't simply guerrilla warfare, because you have these much larger political dimensions, the dimension again of the disintegration of the state and all that follows from that. And I haven't seen any real attempt in JSOC to come to grips with any of that. And of course, now, having lost repeatedly in fourth generation wars, the Pentagon is in effect saying, we're not going to do that. Doesn't matter that that's the way war is going, we're not going to do that anymore. we're going to prepare for wars with Russia and China, which are both nuclear powers, would suggest that probably we're not going to go to war with them. So it's all become just a farce, and it's all become just about money. But yes, JSOC is the closest, probably the closest thing we've had to an attempt to come to grips with 4GW, but it's been pretty wide of the mark.
Very good. Bill, do you want to plug your books real quick before we go?
I usually have them to show here, but that's okay. That's all right, John. I've taken a look at our current situation, and within this context of 4GW and the decline of the state, from a number of different perspectives in 3 and soon to be 4 books. The 4th Generation Warfare Handbook, which is written for practitioners, primarily military, but also law enforcement, is if you're stuck with fighting against non-state opponents, how do you do it? Victoria is my novel under the pen name Thomas Hobbes, because it's an update of Leviathan, that set 50 years in the future here, that talks about the breakup of the United States, 4th generation war in North America, and how at least part of the former US recovers by recovering the old culture. Victoria ultimately calls itself that, the nation of Victoria, because it returns to the Victorian period, because it works. And my retroculture book, which will be out shortly, is the basis for that recovery, is a retroculture movement where people deliberately go back to the old ways of thinking and living because they worked. And the new ways as they have emerged since the 1960s have failed. And then finally, although it was actually written first, is a policy book, The Next Conservatism, which is a book for, ideally, Republicans, conservatives in Washington, looking at, all right, if we understand that this is the course we're on, if we understand we're caught up in a world where perhaps the single most important thing going on is the decline in the state, what do we do in a policy sense? So I've walked around the elephant, if you will, and looked at it from 4 different directions. And the retroculture book should be out this quarter from Arctos Books. And the other 3 are all readily available.
Great. And then, Jeff, you've got a book too. You want to show it off?
Sure. Yeah, so I got my book, American Cobra Pilot, The Marine Remembers a Dog and Pony Show. So it's about a lot of things in the military, but it centers around a military exercise that I was a part of on my first deployment. And just recently, the Marine Corps came out and said that we need to upgun our Navy ships to deal with coastal defense cruise missiles. So the Marine Corps I think they're a little bit too late to the game, but they're finally realizing that maybe we can't do a forced entry landing like we did at Iwo Jima, because now there's anti-ship missiles. But it's a satirical take, like a Vonnegut style take of everything I saw and all the other social engineering that's going on in the military. So it's a fun read about a lot of different stuff that I saw.
It gives a very good insight, Jeff, into the farce that is the current military seen from within. I mean,
Yes.
we see it from without, and we see a lot of farcical aspects like women infantry and so forth. But you're seeing the farce from within, and particularly the farce that is far too much of our training.
Yes. Yep. Exactly. So
thanks everyone for watching live, and thanks for everyone that'll watch this in the future. And thanks to my panel for another great conversation, and we will see you in, well, maybe next week, but I don't think that Bill will have the technical availability for the next.
There are technical issues here. I am putting in a new high-pressure steam plant. And I'm thinking that once it is in, we will have a better quality audio and video as well. It is based on the steam plant and the Hipper class heavy cruisers, and we will take a few weeks to get it in place.
outstanding.
Yeah, there's probably a few bugs we'll have to work out before we can
Well, the
get back
Hippers
online.
broke down all the time, so that this
Yeah,
Yeah.
understandable.
Familiar.
It's not a It's not a Westinghouse nuclear generator, Bill. It's not a Westinghouse nuclear steam generator. No.
No, we still burn coal here.
Okay.
We love the smell.
So we might be back online next week. It might be a couple weeks. So
It might be a couple of weeks before the steam plant's working.
So stay tuned, and we'll be back eventually. But thanks for tuning in. Good night.
Good night.
Thanks. Good night.